so you know.
Okay.
And I'm going to let everybody in.
All right.
Should I respond to Jason, or should you get going on what you really want?
Well, it's all recording. Hi, everybody.
That's all right. That's all right, Rocco. It's okay.
My name is Colleen Stovall, and I'm the Director of Programs and Events for AIA Miami and the Miami Center for Architecture and Design. And I'd like to welcome you today. And before we get started, I'd just like to remind you that if you aren't a member of AIA Miami, if you are a student, you get 18, once you graduate, you get 18 free months of membership. So we would love to have you join up. There's lots of benefits. You can check out your website, aiamiami.org. And Glenda, who do you have that's going to introduce everyone? Is that you?
Jason. Well, Jason will give a brief intro about the festival.
Great. My name is Jason Tapia. I'm an architect and principal of Building Center number 3. We're a small design firm here in Miami. I want to thank everybody for participating in today's event. This is informally our 3rd annual Miami Architecture and Design Film Festival. I want to thank my friend, colleague, and co-chair Glenda, and Cheryl and Colleen from MCAD and the faculty at UM and FIU and the AIAS of both schools for their efforts to help make this come together. And also thank the producers of the film for making it available again this year in this format. This film was originally screened last year at our 2nd annual film festival, which focused on architecture and social justice. It was well received, and we had a great substantive discussion after the screening, and I'm sure we will have a great discussion this year as well, despite the challenges. I hope everyone continues to stay safe and that we use this pandemic as a catalyst to discuss how architects and architecture can continue to positively impact the health, safety, and welfare of the public we serve. And with that, I'll let Glenda continue from here.
Thanks, Jason. Well, actually, it's going to be the students who will run this in a way, but I'm going to just give Megan the word.
Oh, okay. Well, hi, I'm Megan. I'm the president of the FIU chapter of AIAS. For those who don't know what AIAS is, we're the student branch of AIA. So we work we're with the universities, working with the students, trying to prepare them not only for their classes and what they're experiencing in the architectural schools, but also once they get out into the workplace. So I'll be the moderator. I also have another moderator. His name's Stanley Evans, and he should be here hopefully very shortly. But until then, I just want to let the panelists introduce themselves and maybe say a brief introduction about who they are and what they do. So I open it to you guys.
Okay, so back to me. I can do that really quickly. So my name is Glenda Puente. I'm an adjunct faculty at FIU and UM. And also I'm the co-founder of the Miami Architecture and Design Film Festival with Jason. I'm also an architect, licensed. So in a way, I've gone through the system that most of, the students that are here will be going through in terms of exams and things like that soon. So I'm just happy to be here and see what questions you guys have from that perspective. Malu?
Hi, everybody. I am Malu. I am an architect from Ecuador. I run an office with 3 other partners, which is named Alborde Arquitectos. And we were producers of the film Hacer Mucho Con Poco. And I am very happy to be invited here and this event. Thank you very much.
Rocco?
Sure, thank you, and thank everyone for inviting me. I'm humbled. I just want to say before I say who I am that I think the film is brilliant, Malu. It's just a fantastic film. I don't know Ecuador well, but I've been a few times to Quito, to Santo Domingo, to different places there. My wife is Ecuadorian. She's from Quito. And so I'm really proud of the work being done there. I think it's just incredibly cool and awesome. So, and anyway, I'm a professor at UM, teaching architecture, and for the last 11 years teaching design build with my design build partner, Jim Adamson, who is of Jersey Devil fame. He's been a partner with Jersey Devil since the 70s, since 1975. And we've been doing about one project a year since 2009, and very excited to be part of this discussion. So thank you for inviting me, and thanks to the students for putting all this together, and Glenda and Jason.
All right. Well, if you guys are ready, I think I'm just going to jump into the first question of the event. So the title of the film, as we all know, is Hacer Mucho Con Poco, which translates to doing more with less. So we see this on screen with the architects building with local materials and gathering materials from the site, and essentially building at very super affordable cost. So we were wondering, what is this process like?
I think this process, you have to realize a lot of the context you are in. So it's like each time you face a project, you are, or you try to be in a mood for trying to define the particularities of that specific place, that specific people. The questions you ask to the context, to the people, are like very, I would say, like very concrete. Like, for example, which materials do you use? Why the size of the pieces, for example, if they are made by wood or by bamboo, how many people, because all this information is going to be very valuable for you to make the design. We try to use most of the know-how the people already have there. And we try to use the materials you have in this context. And we also like try to just go with the flow somehow, like with the time the people have and so on, because that makes easier the project to do in some way. I mean, it's already complicated, so you have to realize that if there are parts that you can make it easier, you have to approach these parts as well. So all the things about the time, the people, the materials, the cost, the resources, and so on. And when we have work in context, we do not know too much about the context. What we have done is also trying to find specific people that has already worked in that context and can give us also a lot of information. Otherwise, for us, will take a lot of time to get to know this information. More or less like that.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's definitely a very interesting process, and that's why we were wondering, what goes behind, getting to the finishing point. Stanley Evans has just joined us. He's the other moderator, so I'm just gonna give him the space to say hello and ask the second question when he's ready.
Yes, good evening, everyone. My apologies for joining late. I was watching the film again. But I am the FIU NOMA's chapter president. Thank you so much for joining. It's definitely a pleasure to have you all. I'm going to ask the second question now. So usually people give the inexpensive negative connotation of like, so looking at different materials, we don't want to look at the materials and think that, each material is specifically for a specific class. So given the current capitalistic society, how can we put aside the classism to encourage an architecture that isn't about the glamorous material, but more about actually having the material flexible for each class specifically? So making sure that, we don't specifically allocate each material for these specific buildings to a specific class. So in the film, I've seen that you were able to kind of allocate different materials and try to sway away from the classism. So how did you specifically, you know, have that connotation for that?
Well, this is very personal answer, no? Because if you ask maybe my partners, they will give you another answer. But for me, when I finished architecture school, I didn't know what was beautiful and what was ugly. I didn't understand what was like the difference. And just having a social connotation of what was good looking or not, for me, like wasn't enough, because it wasn't convinced me at all. So my research and my questions start to get like more in the field of trying to be more logical, more objective, more about the cost, more about the, if I can use really cheap materials, for example, I can, if I have a resource of money, maybe it's better to pay better the people and expense and try to use less money in the material if the material is good enough, even though maybe it's not so well received because somehow this is material for building places for poor people or something like that. So we were trying to make, I don't know exactly how conscious that was, but at some point it was a research like looking for more logical, useful answers to the context. So for example, we use wood in places that the wood is easier to get or cheaper, or the people know how to use the wood. And if, I mean, this is better because if I spend less in using this material, less money, I can make maybe a bigger space or with more light or, you know, like other stuff there. So in the end, when you see the projects, you can make conclusions about these things, like it's a capitalistic world or not. But I also think it has to do a lot with aesthetics, and the aesthetics maybe conceiving I don't know, more there's a lot of prejudice also there, no? Like this is for poor people and this is not, but then it's somehow when you build another stuff that is also made with these materials, maybe is also like more exotic or something like that. So I don't really understand that fear, but our search is, as I say, trying to be like more useful, more logical. If we have a subjectivity, of course, but we try to this subjectivity of the aesthetics and so on, to discuss it with the client and try to put this subjectivity more for the client than for the architect, more or less. Mm-hmm.
Glenda, Rocco, do you guys have these similar like conversations within yourselves and with your teams when you're approaching like design, or like what materials should we use, or like what is the aesthetics of a project in the terms of like this this kind of conversation? Do you guys face a similar issue?
Well, in my case, with the projects I've been involved in, they're all, you know, very low cost. So even though it's here, we have some of the same problems. And the client, in a way, I mean, I don't know if it's just been my experience so far, but they listen to you. They want to, you know, the ones I've worked with, at least, they, you know, trust in you. And I think as long as what their goals are still achieved, you know, just an example, a project about community outreach, making a street in downtown Miami more pedestrian. If we achieve the event and people come out and support the project, you know, they're not really kind of telling you what to use expensive materials. But again, budget was always something that we were conscious about. So I think it's also sort of maybe the architect's responsibility to make sure that you are also proposing these solutions and expanding the palette, I think, and trying to push those, like you say, prejudice like against a certain material or a certain way of construction. not to defend what's going on, sometimes when it's an exaggeration, but over here you have these codes that are very stringent, like energy codes and things like that. So there are some materials that or some compositions that sometimes it's hard to do at a bigger scale. But like I said, the projects I've been involved in are still pretty small and sort of, you know, I can still in a way control that aspect.
It's a great question. Materials are so, the choice of materials and where you get them and so on, I think is one of the great lessons of the film too, is how many of the projects were built with local materials. And it's so important because not only is the material available, it tends to be less expensive, but tied to it is a whole knowledge of a group of people that know how to work with the material and know how it behaves and know how long it lasts. And there's a lot of deep things that are attached to the choice of materials. New materials, you know, can often be interesting too. They come with some risks. You don't know necessarily how they'll perform. Whether their additional cost is really going to pan out in terms of whether the people using it are going to be able to maintain it. You know, that's also another issue, is the maintenance side of it. If it's local and it's readily available, if something rots or falls apart, you can replace it, you know, because the material's available. If it's something that's really expensive and has to be shipped from a great distance, chances are people aren't going to replace it with the same material. They'll put something else in its place. We build for a lot of not-for-profit clients. You know, that's kind of our focus. People that don't have the ability to, you know, hire an architect or don't have the money to spend on a project. So we work a lot with salvage materials. We work with clients that have very little budgets. And so Jim and I, particularly me, I'm always looking for material that people are throwing away. I have to say we've used a lot of salvaged material because in the United States it's the throwaway culture. People, when they feel like it doesn't look good anymore, they just throw it away. And so lots of times the material's perfectly fine. You can send it through a planer or a joiner and make it work, and it's beautiful stuff. So I think it really is, as Malu's saying, it's how you look at the material that makes it something valuable and something usable. You know, the great tradition of building in a lot of cultures, in vernacular cultures in particular, is just figuring out how to use the material at hand, you know, and doing something interesting with it. So I think there's just a lot of value in doing that.
Yeah. Definitely when you guys were answering, you were talking a lot about, you know, experimenting with these materials, and also, Glenda, you talked about like engaging the community, and that was something that that we noticed in the film, that, you know, in Latin American, I guess the way the construction process, it's very heavily influenced by community, like inviting them to participate in this process, and a lot of experimentation and play. And we were wondering how can we incorporate that into the way that we approach architecture in America, you know, on a much greater sense, the same way that it is in how it seems to be in Latin America.
Again, I think it's up to you as well to allow for these things to happen. In a project that I've been involved in, actually, with you know, it's not a city project, it's something that a neighbor in downtown thought about us downtown street being more pedestrian friendly. It is a project for the community in the end. So we had to make them, you know, get invested in the project. And it's very interesting to see that in the film, right? Because you go to these sometimes alienated communities, but the same happens here. I mean, this project is in downtown Miami, and you have condos around the street with, you know, it's not an isolated town, it's the downtown, and you still have to make sure that the neighbors feel like they own the project too. In this case, we couldn't even have done it without the community because there was, you know, the budget was so scarce. So we needed the extra hands, we needed volunteers to come out, and we did some things, you know, that had to do with painting the streets. So in that case, they could lend a hand with painting. That's something, you know, that can be easily done. So, and then after the project was done, it was actually just a pilot project, a weekend project. So after it's done, because they had worked on it, they cared about it, and they would ask, are we going to do it again? Is this going to be permanent? And it helps the project because then it's not just about the architect and the few people on the team to be pushing for that, let's say to the city, to make these types of changes more permanent. But now we have all the volunteers that worked on it, that sweated that day, that saw their work turn into something cool that evening that more people, hundreds of people now could enjoy. So now they feel part of the project, and they too become voices that, you know, speak about those goals and try to help to make it happen for the future in a more permanent way.
If Malu and Rocco want to tag in on that question as well.
Yeah, I was thinking that I think it is somehow what Glenda just said. Like when you involve either is a community or I don't know, a client like a family for making a house. For me, it's the same process. Is the difference is just the scale. So because of the scale, maybe you get different tools, but the goal is more or less the same. So you are involved in a very experimental process, and the architect knows a lot of tools for making this process to happen. But there are a lot of things that can change from one project to another. And it's good that they change. It's good for the project. Each time they are different things. The architect has to somehow realize they are there. And the more direct thing is to ask the people that is going to live there, like and not just asking like you start asking in a very general way, but then I see it like in layers. So the most you ask, you get like deeper responses, deeper, more attached to what they want, what they feel. And these things are good for the project. Like, for example, a very easy example. Maybe I have an idea of what is a comfortable kitchen and has nothing to do with the idea of a comfortable kitchen for a community or even for a couple that wants to make a house. And so I will ask them, and then with my tools as an architect, I try to translate what they are telling me to do into architecture. So I think in this process, the clients or the community, the people that is going to use the space gets more involved, like has more responsibility, because it's also a project that has a lot of experimentation. It's kind of make yourself responsible for like your liberty of experimentation somehow.
Yeah, I mean, with our projects, when we're doing design build with students, we have the students really try to take ownership of the project, interview the client. We do a very collaborative design process where nobody really owns any ideas. We rotate the teams of students constantly, so no team really has complete control of the project. And we also don't ever vote on anything. There has to be consensus, which means the students have to decide together what the best path is. We never do a vote. And so finally, we then produce a very complete set of drawings and a 1 inch to a foot model that we present to the client, which is one of the reasons the model's so large is so that the students really get a sense of how to build it. But one of the interesting things about all of our projects, and we have people work on the projects too that are not students. If people in the community want to work on it, or somebody from another discipline wants to participate, as long as we train them on the tools so that they know how to use things safely, they can participate. But one of the things that's very interesting about the dynamic of a project is, you know, once you start building, a project takes on a kind of life of its own, and things that you draw don't necessarily make sense when you're building. And you find that out pretty quickly, you know, that like you could draw it and then you're building it and go, oh, this really doesn't work, or it's not the right way to do it. So we do a lot of prototyping and mocking up of things where, you know, we try to build it in another form before we build it in the final form. And sometimes out of different materials, lots of things like that. I think one of the comments in the film that was really interesting is, I can't remember who said it, but somebody said architecture students quickly find out how unuseful their hands are, you know, when they start building. Like it's a whole nother education to use your hands to build than it is to draw or to tap a keyboard, you know. And materials don't behave, you know, and they twist and they're heavy and they bend and they break. And that doesn't happen when you're at your drawing table, you know, or your laptop. So that's kind of one of the fun things about it, really, is this whole other world that you suddenly engage that's very tactile, you know. So
Yes, definitely.
That's why we still push for physical models in school, and all the students eye roll, you know, like it's not important. It's still, you know, it's a skill that's needed to, you know, make sure you know how to put something this big together is really the first step to getting to know how to put anything together, you know, that's larger later.
I think can I comment on that?
Yes, definitely. Go
I think
ahead.
one of the great things Glenda is talking about and getting to is, I mean, really before the kind of profession of architecture existed, people just built things, you know. They went out and made things. They just did it, you know. And then over time, we developed in different countries, whether it's the United States or Latin America or Europe, we developed a profession of architecture that had to do with larger concepts and drawing and the orders and all these other aspects. But originally people just made things. And so in a way, what's so important about what Malu's doing and all the work that's being done in Ecuador and all the design build work that's being done is reconnecting to that past, which was really foundational and has been lost. So this isn't a new path, really. It's recovering an old path that existed before. And I think that's one of the great things about the film in a way too, is it's reconnecting a whole culture and group of people that really belong to that tradition and have been excluded, you know, so.
Yes, definitely. And that leads us to like the next question. You know, as students, we always are taught the importance of good concept, even with our projects being more abstract than realistic. And in the movie, we see that the students in Ecuador seem to approach the design differently, making sure that the project can actually be built in real life. So I want to ask, what's the importance of concept versus it being actually built, in your opinion?
So for us, it's like we incorporate both of these extremes you're mentioned, the concept and also the building. The idea when we were designing the methodology for the design class was trying to teach what for us would have been nicer that we learn in school. And this is because all the things Glenda and Rocco have mentioned before. Like when I finished the School of Architecture, I have absolutely no idea how to build something. And as I approach my profession, like in real life, I have to be an architect, I felt really, really empty about all this information of construction, of, I don't know, the professional situation here, the builders, all these things now. I mean, I have a knowledge about theory, but I really wasn't sure how to apply that to reality, my reality. So for us was, we thought if the student has to develop all the process, like from the very beginning to conceptualize all the needs of the client, that in this case, they are themselves. Also because there is a thing about motivation and also responsibility. That's why they are in charge of their own project. And they have to face all the phases of the design and building process. They can realize like all the complexity of this whole process. That was somehow the purpose of this methodology.
I agree that it's both, not, you know, one extreme or the other. And, you know, in school here, we get a lot of, yes, desk work, like you called it, and a lot of theory and concept. So I encourage the students to try to look for ways. I mean, even if their school doesn't offer a design build studio, for example, in my university where I went at UF, I didn't participate in anything like that. I don't know if actually they had it, but I think you can, I now know that you can still go out and find these opportunities outside of academia even. So there are exhibitions, call for artists, for designers to do installations, things that I actually encountered once I was already licensed, ironically, but those are things that I could have gotten involved with as a student and could have gotten my hands on materials and building and doing things like that. And I think that also can apply for any internships you have or any jobs at firms that you may have. Ask, if you're not taken to the site, ask to be taken to the site, to the construction site. You have to really see what you're drawing, how things get put together, or how they, you know, if they get put together correctly or if they get put together incorrectly. You still learn from both a lot, actually. So I really think it's both, and we do get a lot of one side of that. I think here in the United States in general, but if it's up to you. You can still find avenues to get some on-hands training if you want it. And let me just pitch. Actually, FIU has FIU by Design, which is, the director is Professor Mark Marine. It's real life projects. I don't think you get to build. You'd have to check with him. I participated one time as a faculty. Basically, you get a project, a real life project, and there's a team of 2 faculty members. At least in the time I participated, it was 2 faculty members, and then we had a team of students, about 6 or 8 students. And we had a real life project with a real life client. And there was that portion, I guess, of maybe some hands-on client relationship. We actually had to do presentations about the project. So, and it pushed the students, you know, a little bit outside the studio, and it wasn't, you know, interning at a firm either. So it was kind of like in the middle. And I think starting to get involved with those just puts you out there, and you can see other things that you could be doing. So I definitely encourage students to look at that option if they're at FIU.
I hope I still remember the question. It was between concept and material, or?
Yeah, so basically, you know, in school, we're always, you know, push the fact that we need to focus on concept. But I know that in the film, you know, the main educational aspect is actually understanding how we actually built in real life. So wanted to know how important that is, you know, moving up into your world, how important it is concept over being actually built. So that's the real question.
Well, you know, I agree with everything that's already been said. You know, in teaching design build, we put a lot of emphasis on the ideas coming out of the construction and out of a knowledge of materials. In other words, not having a concept or idea, let's say, that is not based in somehow in a material or a detail choice. Now, with that said, that's hard to imagine how to do until you've done it. You know, once you've built something, you have a knowledge of like what's a reasonable tolerance. You know, like is a quarter building to a quarter of an inch or an eighth of an inch or a 16th of an inch. What's the reasonable tolerance that you can imagine something be assembled to, and what do you draw it to, and so on. And you know, concepts like shim space and things like that don't make any sense until you've built something. So, I mean, I really think the great thing, the lesson about designing and building as one experience in connecting concept and material is that one, that you learn the idea of what constitutes a reasonable level of detail or tolerance, how you might resolve a corner or not, you know, what kind of spacings occur, how much you leave for expansion and contraction, all those kinds of things that you really can't get a handle on until you do it. So your question, I think, is a great one because, I think it's what I would say would be really helpful in a lot of curricula, in a lot of schools, is for students to engage building very early on in their curriculum, not in their last years, but like in their first years. Because then I think when you're designing, I think you would approach design differently, because you have that knowledge, that like physical knowledge of the material, and you know like how heavy things are and what is a reasonable span, because you've dealt with the material. So I think it would make you a better architect to engage building much earlier in your curriculum. And I think the concepts too will be better. They'll be stronger because they'll be rooted in something that's very physical. And, you know, all of those buildings that you see in the film, I think they have a lot of meaning for people because of the fact that not only did some of the people work on some of those projects, but there's a tactility there and a spatial construct that I think gives the projects and spaces meaning beyond an abstract concept, you know? Like, you don't need to know what it means. You just have to know whether the building feels right and the spaces are generous and inspirational. And you look at the way things are joined and you get a sense of, I don't know, a great sense of completeness when you see a nice joint come together in an interesting way. So I think that's where the concept then finally comes to. And if you try to say that beforehand, like you try to say, you know, I have this great concept about, you know, the intersection of bamboo and steel and concrete, and you draw it a certain way, but then you're going to make it another way. And, you know, it's hard to imagine what kind of span you're going to have and all that stuff until you've done it. So anyway, it's a rambling kind of response.
Before we go on to the next question, I have a side question. And I also seen in the film the educational aspect where students are able to actually go to these sites and see firsthand how these structures are built. Is that something that is included into the curriculum with education over in Ecuador? And also, do you recommend students, while being in school, you know, early on, you know, going into these specific sites, trying to learn as much as possible on site, but also go to school as well? Is that something that you recommend?
I am not sure I really understand the question, but you say that if is normally usually in Ecuador that students visit.
Yeah, we've seen in the film that, you know, on the academia side, that students were able to kind of see, you know, the structure go up and actually understand how the structure was built, things of that nature. is that something that you recommend for students to kind of, do while in school, kind of understand these structures while they're being built so they can, pass it on to their studies while in school?
Yeah, totally. And I think the reason is Rocco already explained it, like the approach of building, of you realizing how these things are being built, modifies your meaning, your ideas, your process of systematization, the information of the concepts, and I think also influences your design methodology. Or I mean, at least would be very nice to do that, and to find like your own path. But if you have information of how the things are built, I think is well, for me it's easier to realize stuff. Otherwise would be very disconnected to the reality.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Well, go ahead, Megan, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. It was a good question. It's basically, ways to better incorporate this curriculum of design build in American education. And you guys essentially like did answer that, but if there was any other ways that we could do that, whether it's from an educator standpoint or a student standpoint, what are ways that we can do that?
I think the more that you can engage construction on a lot of levels, the better. We have a course that's taught. It's kind of like a lecture course where there's a faculty who takes students to building sites. They're not sites that the students have designed and built themselves. Obviously, they're sites by other architects, but the students really enjoy going to the sites and seeing the construction and seeing, talking to the architect, talking to the contractor, client, and getting those different perspectives on the project, which is also interesting. The architect, the contractor, the owner, the client, they all can sometimes see things very much the same, or they can see them very differently depending on the scale of the project and what's being done. So that's another format without like necessarily teaching design build. Teaching a furniture course. We've had faculty teach furniture, which is a wonderful way of, in a way, engaging materials and ideas at a smaller scale. Usually a more refined scale and a more refined sense of craft, because the project's small. You can really do kind of detailing and finishing that you might not be able to do necessarily with a larger project, given the time. But a lot of it, the question's a good one. A lot of it relates to how we teach, how long a semester is, how long a project you're doing, whether you're doing design build for a year or a semester or 2 years, or it's a thesis project. All of those kinds of, questions of time are things that might frame that question in a particular way. And we do design build in 16 weeks, which is very short from concept to finished construction. We don't always finish on time, I can tell you that. We've had projects that should be 16 weeks that have taken a year, unfortunately. But, we always finish, that's the thing. We always tell our clients, we always promise them it'll be on budget, it never goes over budget, and it will be finished. Now, it may take longer, but we always finish. But students, I think, can get a variety of different experiences to answer your question, depending on the format that you present.
Okay, great. So I have one of my vice president, John, wants to ask a question to the panel. John, you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I recently typed in the chat the question because estoy haciendo mucho con poco Wi-Fi. We're being on the Zoom call right now. I'm right now working on a project in El Darién with the local Embra, Indigenous tribe, and the local Darienitas. And right now, I saw that Rocco, you celebrated Indigenous vernacular architectural design, and I love Indigenous vernacular. It's one of my passions. However, I feel like right now we're going through a lot of resource shortage in the region. And so we're trying to find new sustainable resources around us to kind of build upon. And my question in watching the film was that I saw that, for example, in the construction of the disaster shelters, sort of like post the earthquake in Ecuador, and the utilization of the eucalyptus, adjacent eucalyptus grove in the close proximity to the site is more like what is primarily considered. Like, I feel like a lot of these projects are developed as rapidly as possible to sort of meet the urgent. I just saw a falcon just grab something. That was crazy. But a lot of the projects are done with a sense of urgency. It's like we need to address the needs of this community. We need to do it fast. But it's also like, is sustainability really considered as far as like, will this be able to last the community for future recurring projects? Is it sustainable? Or is it more like we need to meet this demand now and with what's available right now?
I think depends on the project, even the concept of sustainability, because it will be in Ecuador very, very different if you approach a project in a city like Quito, for example, or if you are approaching a project in a very rural area where the transportation is like very difficult to reach or very expensive, or in an area which is a mixture of both, which is the case of the places we built the prototype post-earthquake. That's why they were like a mixture of industrialization process and also techniques that people get to know when they live in more rural areas. But I think it will be, depends on the project. Again, like I was thinking also the concept of efficiency, for example, not just sustainability, but efficiency as well. Like it's going to be very different if you try to approach or be efficient in I mean, the strategies will be very different if you are trying to make a project in a city where you don't have too many, in the case of Ecuador, too many issues regarding to the cost of transportation, for example, which is a very high cost, or you have a lot of materials like in staff, hardware stores or whatever. But in rural areas, it changes completely the strategy. And it's good, I think, that these things, very practical, modifies the concept of sustainability or of efficiency. Also, to question ourselves, is it good that all the things has to last forever or not necessarily? Which cases it is good or not? Depends on the project, I think.
I think the longevity of the project can, also, there are projects that maybe were not built with the most sustainable materials, but they've lasted 500 years. So you divide, what it took by the amount of time that it had stood, and then it becomes something that's more sustainable. But in the case of the earthquake, it was an emergency, right? People needed housing in that moment. But what I think was very interesting in the film, and there's no reason why we couldn't think about that, even in a non-emergency situation, is the aspect of this prototype. I'm getting confused now if it was for the earthquake one, but there was one where they were making the prototype and then thinking how it could grow in the future, so that it's not something descartable, something that you can just toss, that okay, you get it now, you do it now, and then you toss it, and then you get something bigger, better later. But that it's like the first step to then a future potential project. And I also think you could apply that to anything, even to your own house. Maybe if you don't have the budget right now for all the space you would want, you start small, but you design it and you use materials that allow you to then grow in you know, in increments or in modules. So you've made that thing that you built at the beginning now is more sustainable in time.
Yeah, John, it's a great question. You know, boy, material choices are really, as I've said, are really, really, you know, sort of central and important questions to ask when you're doing any project. I think the range of projects in the film show a different different approaches to it. There was one particularly poetic project I remember in the film, and I'm not sure I'll get it right, but it was a barn that was made up of lots of different types of masonry units. And it had a rubber tire, almost like a barrel tile, rubber tile approach to the roofing. And one of the really good things about that project that I thought was really smart was the use of paint, you know, as the unifying element. Like if you don't have a lot of, if you don't have the choice to, let's say, make one material choice or two material choices, and you have to use lots of different things, in that project, they used paint to unify all the different materials. And so that was kind of clever, you know, like sometimes you have to think outside the box a bit in terms of finding a solution that will solve the problem based on the context that you're in. And Malu is bringing that up. It's all about context in terms of where you're building, how you're building, you know, level of detail. We teach design build in a building because students who are building it, they don't have time to go off site and work. They have other classes, so they literally have like a 3 or 4 hour window. So we have to build all of our work as a modular construction that can go down the road and then be assembled on the site. So they have to build everything to become apart again and be reassembled on the site. So they have a kind of double whammy in terms of construction. They have to build it, and then they have to design it with the notion that it has to come apart and has to go down the road and meet the DOT requirements for width and height. That also puts a lot of pressure on material choices. So what Malu was saying too about availability, transportation, it also depends on what you can get, where, when. It shouldn't stop you from experimenting with materials. I mean, I always believe in that because sometimes you'll find something interesting and unusual that you didn't think of. And then its longer life cycle costs might be worth the added expense and effort. But to the last point that Glenda brought up too, which was the issue of thinking about how long the project is going to last. If you look at a lot of early indigenous vernacular architecture, like in South Florida, for instance, we have a structure called the Chiki, which is a Seminole Miccosukee structure made of cypress poles and palm thatch. Those buildings, I mean, they're incredibly efficient. They can last for years or they can last for one hurricane season. But the amazing thing is the material can be, you know, if you've seen the Miccosukee built, they can put on a roof on a Chiki in an afternoon, you know? So it doesn't matter if the project gets destroyed in a hurricane, they can be rebuilt the next day, you know? And so that's also something to consider is how difficult it would be to rebuild or source the materials after a disaster like an earthquake or a hurricane or, you know, any kind of storm.
Thank you. I really appreciate that insight. I just kind of wanted to give an example of the indigenous vernacular here. Here they were using, sort of similar to using palm thatch roofs that they used in South Florida. They were using a very particular species of palm where they were able to take the tree bark and make the floor slabs and take the same leaves to make the roofs. However, the issue now is that that palm is now highly endangered. And so now what they've been doing is here, there are no roads from either Panama or from Colombia. So we're pretty much stranded here. And the only palm that they really relied on is now critically endangered. And what they've been doing is importing by boat. First off, we have to ship it to the coast of Colombia, get it on a boat, and then ship it to the other side of the Gulf de Urabá. So there's no material transportation, and these people are very poor, you know. So we need to figure out what can we be using. What I've been trying to look at is I've been doing a lot of research on the utilization of how much bark content we could possibly put into making fiberboard. Just find fiberboard as an alternative when we've been using structural materials. And I've also been looking a lot at utilizing the very rocky coast to take those rocks and start forming, again, very low fab techniques to start forming like sort of gabion walls to be able to ventilate the spaces to meet the cross ventilation requirements while reducing the ecological impact. So like transportation is everything here. So we have to make with what we got, but we also have to conserve the ecosystem, which ultimately yields the economy of this town, because it's a very ecotourism rooted little pueblo. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it.
John, could I add something to that, which is you bring up a really good point about replacing resources that you use from a site. And I think part of a picture should be that we also study and promote arboriculture, you know, that if you take a tree down, you plant 2 trees or whatever. In other words, you think about the fact that these resources are not, you know, endless, you know, that you have to replace them, you have to be conscious of them. I actually grow endangered and threatened trees in my own yard and in other places. I give away about 50 to 100 trees a year of this really rare species of tree called Guaiacum sanctum. It's lignum vitae, which was heavily used. It's a tropical tree. It's been used in South America, Central America, and other places for lots of uses. It's a beautiful tree, slow growing. But there isn't any more of it, you know, and people don't build with it. You really shouldn't build with it. But on other species, even if it's bamboo is fast growing and it's a renewable resource, but you still have to replant it. You know, you can't cut a whole forest down and then not replant it. So Japanese culture is very good about this in terms of temple design. They build a temple, then they grow the trees for the next 400 years that they're going to use for the next temple. So we need to think that way too about our resources, you know, how we can replenish them as we use them.
I was going to say about what you said. That is very interesting because I think most of the times architects don't usually resolve the problem we have to resolve. So we invent another problem and we resolve the problem that we invent. But as you were explaining your problem, I thought he is trying to solve the problem he's having, like the big problem. So that's already huge. Because I think it's not so easy to find out that. And then make the problem you have, how when you solve it, you potentialize all the rest. Because you have tools. I mean, you went to university, you study architecture. So what tools that you already have can help solving the problem you have, and not just solving, but potentialize the context even more. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Malu, I think, can I say one thing about respond to Malu, because I think it's interesting. If you planted a little grove of endangered and threatened trees, you would probably, it's not just the trees that you plant, it's the fact that you provide food for the birds that eat those seeds. Those seeds pass through their digestive system when they migrate from, you know, Ecuador through the Florida Panhandle to the north and back every year. So what happens is you start producing lots of different trees all over the place just by creating a sort of small culture, a small ecosystem on your property. So little things can have a big impact, just like the film, you know, begins to talk about, you know. And if everybody thought that way, I mean, I think it would, it's a cultural shift, you know, so.
Yeah, definitely. You know, now you guys are, we're having discussion, you start to talk about like social change and activism and what we can do in this like macrocosm of the community. And the next question that we had perfectly lines up, because we were wondering like, how can we use these principles of design build and haciendo mucho con poco, and to encourage a community and to encourage social change within that region?
Well, I mean, you can have a lot of views about that title, doing more with less. But the first thing that came up to my mind is something Rocco already mentioned, that before architects, people were already building stuff. I'm pretty good. So I always ask myself, where or what do we do architects to make it better? Because sometimes we realize we are, how you say, like very useful, and not necessarily. Like we have to find out where our effort, where we put our effort to add more, to make it amazing, or to make it better, or to solve the problem, but it's not so obvious. And when you start realizing that there's a lot of stuff people are solving without the architects, I think your view becomes like more specific to the details, and you have to realize where to put your effort. So you, I don't know, start being more, I don't know how to say in English, like, yeah, like the details, for example, of the materials, of the people, of the time, the building process, and so on, no? And also you realize that you don't need to expend a lot of money or a lot of time. It's just more like trying to balance all the things you have, which is, I think, is very complex to do, to get a balance of all the variables you have to organize to make a project happen. And also you start questioning about whether to spend so much money on the project or to pay so much for specific materials. I mean, in some cases it's good. I mean, in my mind, I think maybe a hospital should have the best, I don't know, materials from everything, you know, because it's a matter of health. But for making, I don't know, right now I am building a, how do you say, a mirador, viewer, a viewer
Like
in a natural reserve.
Watchtower, is it a tower? A viewing point.
Yeah, a viewpoint. So for making a viewpoint, maybe it's not necessary all that technology, all that materials, you know. So I think also return to the question of depends on the context.
Are we good on time, Colleen?
I'm under the Cheryl rule, which is 1 hour. So we're, let's see if we can have less thoughts maybe from people, or and start to wrap up the evening. This has been fascinating conversation.
All right, so
but we have to
all right,
end.
so to wrap it up, just our final question, just to wrap it up from everyone. From the film, you know, in Latin America, what can we learn from Latin American architecture and kind of use it as students in America? Like, what are the biggest key lessons that we can learn from the film that you would think that we should incorporate in America? That'll be our wrap-up question.
Well, I was going to say, and to me, I mean, thinking about the biggest lesson from the film, like Malu said, to me is the title, is, to do more with less. And I think that's also the lesson. I think for us here in the United States, like Rocco mentioned it, it's a consumerist society. So I think that's the great lesson, really, which in Latin America, I don't think they're really trying to give a lesson on this. It's just what they can do because it's so hard economically, right? It's so different there, what, how much money can buy in terms of materials and things like that. So I think that's the lesson that we can have here, that even if you do have the means to spend all that you want, think about really how can you just stretch the budget or the resources as much as you can to do the most that you can with the least. And it just ties a little bit too into the previous question from Megan about social justice. I mean, justice, fairness, it's really about trying to serve as many people as possible. And I think that's really where, the justice would be, the just thing to do would be to serve as many people as you can. So I think with being responsible with the resources is a way to do that.
Also, I think in contexts like in Ecuador and other countries in Latin America, we always have this feeling that we are like is going out of your comfort zone all the time. So somehow you get used to do that, and you have less fear of just starting something from scratch and experimenting and do something and realizing that you can do stuff, like the things you are imagining, the feelings you are having, even though they are nice feelings that you want to change stuff, or there are feelings that make you uncomfortable, and that's the motivation for doing something, that you can do something about them, that you can resolve by yourself or with your friends. You can act on these feelings, take action and do something. Even though if the context is hard or in crisis or whatever, I don't know, right now that we are in this pandemic, and a lot of people here is like, okay, but we have always been in crisis, so it's just another crisis for Ecuador. And you just have to deal with that and move on, try to resolve and keep going.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'll just say that, I mean, I think the film has lots of great lessons in it. And one of the questions that the film asks is, how can architects be more connected to and have more impact in the world of what's being built out there? I think one of the things the film shows is there's a lot of things being built out there all over the world. Like more than 80% of that's built out there is just built in a more informal manner. So how can we as architects connect more to that world, that culture, communicate better with the population that is really in great need of an architect's skill, perhaps an architect's thinking, but on the other side, how can the architects learn from the community that they're working with in a more profound way, so that their relationship exists as more fundamental? I think one of the things the film said in a couple of instances, that many people never knew what an architect was. They never seen one. They don't understand what an architect is. They may understand that an engineer builds a building, but they don't understand what an architect does. So, and I think even here in the US, you could say the same thing. Like, people are unclear or we've lost, let's say, a connection to the idea that we're somehow masterful at building. We've gotten a reputation as being distanced and not caring about a broader spectrum of the world that's built out there. And I think that's true. And I think, I hope this film gets more broadly distributed around the country. I think it's really good. And I think a lot of people need to see it. And I think it's just, there's a lot there. And Malu should be congratulated, and Glenda should be congratulated for bringing this all together, because this is a great event. And thank you, Stanley and Megan and John, both Johns, for putting this together. I think this has been a really interesting and informative session for me anyway. I'm humbled to be part of it. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Glenda, Malu, Rocco, and Megan for co-moderating this with me. Also, Colleen, thank you so much for being here. We do appreciate, you know, us having this access to the film. Is very informative. Very great for us to learn while in school, and we'll definitely incorporate this into our education. So thank you so much for being here with us. Colleen, if you have any final words before we head off.
No, but thank you so much. This was a great program, a very interesting conversation. We'll be putting the film festival together, I'm sure, late next year. And that's it. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to Rocco, Malu, and Glenda, and Megan, and Stanley. And have a good Saturday and a good, safe holiday, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 See each other
Bye.
again. Bye, everyone.